Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 3 of Victimology. In Chapter 3, we're going to look at consequences of victimization. The first and most obvious consequence is going to be physical injury, which is pretty straightforward. Broken bones, bruises, lacerations, stab wounds, in some cases, acquisition of disease, in the cases of sexual assault victims, and obviously death, right? Just some things to know. Female victims are more likely to sustain injury than their male victims. This is fairly obvious reality of biology is that women are smaller, have less muscle mass, and therefore less upper body strength than men. 38% of all rape victims, regardless of whether they are male or female, suffer physical injury, and 77% of all murder victims are male. And we are going to see, as we talk about different categories of victimization, that there are sort of, air quotes, usual suspects, right? And so these are some examples of those usual suspects, that the majority of murder victims are male. By the way, the majority of murder perpetrators are also male. Right. Just over half of all murder victims are African American, right? So we're going to see different categories of offenders and victims. But what we're going to look at here is that the consequences of victimization are pretty much the same across the board, regardless of any of those demographics. So let's start with psychological consequences. Some people will internalize their reactions to victimization, right? Others will lash out. It depends on the person. Some people, they will be impacted short term. They will suffer short term. Other people will suffer for many years. It's a very individual reaction. But common psychological reactions to crime are depression, anxiety, and a drop in self-esteem. Depression can result in things like sleep disturbances, irritability, feelings of guilt or shame that you somehow caused the victimization or that you should have been smarter and not put yourself in a position of victimization. We might see changes in eating habits, either tremendous overeating or not eating at all and seeing some weight loss, and see a decrease in engagement and activity. Anxiety in response to victimization can also result in things like excessive fear, excessive worrying, coupled with feelings of tension, restlessness, agitation, difficulty concentrating. Anxiety will, among victims, also commonly has a reaction where you're in this constant state of anxiety and it starts to provoke a chronic adrenal response, right? So that you have this constant sort of fight or flight experience, which results in chronic problems like things such as rapid heartbeat, chronic rapid heartbeat, excessive sweating, muscle tension, gastrointestinal issues, and difficulty sleeping. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a very common reaction to victimization, especially violent victimization, in particular sexual assault, physical assaults that are especially serious physical assaults. It's very common for people to come and end up being diagnosed with PTSD. It's even very common for people who simply witness victimization, right? Because especially a violent victimization can be an incredibly traumatic thing to witness. Commonly, these individuals will suffer from PTSD after the fact. So people who have witnessed or experienced something to do with death or the threat of death, the threat of injury followed by, the threat of violence, etc. So people who have PTSD, they experience things like flashbacks, nightmares, chronic nightmares. They continually relive or re-experience the events from an emotional perspective. They can be hypervigilant, easily startled, right? People with PTSD do not enjoy events like fireworks and things of that nature. They tend to have an increase in aggression. Again, they have sleep disturbances. Recklessness is a common reaction in PTSD, making reckless decisions, engaging in reckless activities. And high rates of irritability. It becomes an issue when these symptoms start interfering with daily function, when they get to the point where it's interfering with your ability to successfully execute your job, to have relationships with family members and friends, to take care of yourself, etc. It's estimated that 25% of all victims of crime will experience PTSD, which, by the way, also commonly presents with depression. So when one person has PTSD, they typically also have depression. Some behavioral responses to victimization, there's different things that people do. And the first that we're going to talk about is characterological self-blame. And this is where the individual is going to ascribe the blame of their victimization to something inherent about who they are as a person, that they, air quotes, deserved the victimization because I'm weak, because I'm stupid, because I'm the person everybody picks on because I'm not strong enough to stand up to people, right? That this is a form of self-blame that becomes very negative, has a super negative impact on the healing process of victimization, moving beyond the process of victimization, and certainly is an on point. There's also something called behavioral self-blame, where a person will ascribe the victimization that they suffered to a behavior that they elicited, and that they think, if I eliminate this behavior in the future, it will therefore protect me from becoming a victim in the future. Learned helplessness is also a behavioral response. This is something that has long been researched in psychology, and that's where victims learn that their response to victimization is essentially futile, that, uh, you know, whatever response I give, whether it's to protect myself, to fight back, to, try and reason with you, whatever it is, it's not working, it's futile. So therefore I give no response. I learn helplessness. I become numb. And this is something that we see that occurs in victimization that tends to be unavoidable, tends to be chronic. Um, Most commonly, we see this in victims of domestic violence. Self-harm is a common behavioral response to victimization, typically manifests itself in the form of cutting with the use of knives or some other self-induced injury. This is a symptom of a larger mental illness where the coping mechanisms are lacking, which is why we see the cutting behaviors. This is most commonly demonstrated in victims of trauma, physical trauma, victims who have had chronic abuse and chronic neglect. There's also economic costs to victimization. Both the victim and the public suffer from economic costs when somebody's victimized, which makes victim a public health issue. Okay, so it's not just an issue of you, the victim, suffering, the entirety of the public suffers. So examples of some of those economic costs are going to be cost of medical care, time off work, right? So not only are you losing the income from having to stay home and heal, but your work, your boss's company is losing your productivity because of the crime that happened to you. Property loss, pain and suffering, decreased cost of life, legal costs. These are all economic costs that are incurred both by the victim directly, but also some of these costs are incurred by society. When we look at all of these costs, the totality of all of these costs factored together, we can typically put a monetary number on a certain form of victimization. And we have an average number for the cost of each victimization. So for example, motor vehicle costs on average cost all in with all of those costs, the loss of productivity, the loss of the property, the issues, that I have to get an attorney, I have to go to court, prosecutor costs, etc. It usually ends up being about $9,500, right? Rape costs all in about $157,000 after all the costs of prosecution, incarceration, medical care, loss of productivity, the emotional therapy that needs to be incurred by the victim, right? Murder tends to cost $8.9 million all in when we factor in all those costs. So when you look at the actual monetary cost of each individual instance of victimization, when we look at everything involved with managing victims and managing crime and trying to prevent future victims, it's incredibly costly. Medical care costs are another. So those who need medical care, you have to pay for transportation to get to the medical facility. You have to pay for the doctor's care. You have to pay for prescriptions, medical devices. In the case of death, coroner's fees have to be paid. Funeral expenses have to be paid. Insurance claims and processing fees have to be paid out. And when we put a number or value on all of those things, it adds up, which is where we get that staggering number of $8.9 million for victimization, right? Because it is incredibly costly. Medical costs are going to vary depending on the type of victimization. For example, battered women, all battered women in the United States, we can put a number on that. When we call law enforcement and they get prosecuted, and these women have to have medical care and they have to pay for relocation so that they can live somewhere safely. We've spent about $1.8 million annually on costs for domestic violence victims. Mental health care costs usually cost between 10 and 20% of total mental health care costs that are incurred for crime victims annually. Trying to work through their trauma, trying to manage the negative outcomes of their victimization. That's a pretty staggering chunk of mental health care here in the United States. That about 20% of it is carved out specifically to manage victims of crime. That's a big cost. We talked about losses in productivity. So victims may lose the ability, short-term or long-term, to go to work, to go to school, to take care of their family and their homes due to injury, due to emotional damage, psychological issues, behavioral issues that are occurring as a result of the victimization. And this is what we call it has that trickle down effect that victims' work is likely to suffer while healing. and trying to move on from the victimization. And everybody suffers: the home, the workplace, the family, etc. Pain and suffering can be really hard to quantify. How do we put a dollar amount on a victim's pain and suffering from victimization? Certainly, your pain and suffering is going to vary depending on the crime and the type of victimization that you suffered. How do you put a dollar amount on that? It can be very difficult to define. System costs are absolutely astronomically huge, and system costs are the costs that the criminal justice system is incurred because we have to chase down the perpetrators, we have to process them, we have to prosecute them, we have to incarcerate them. So system costs are absolutely huge, absolutely huge. There are also costs through what we call vicarious victimization. Let's define what that is, though, first, so we all understand. So vicarious victimization is the effect that one person's victimization has on other people, which is most widely going to be suffered by family members. Family members of victims are the most common vicarious victims. Family members of murder victims who suffer sudden violent loss of their loved ones. They have to go through the trial process, which is incredibly time consuming. It's incredibly emotional, right? They have to, they suffer the loss of your income, the household income that helps support the family, etc. So these vicarious victims, especially of homicide, those secondary victims of homicide, those family members, are very likely to go on and suffer from PTSD and have their own emotional and behavioral costs as a result of the victimization to their loved one. Sadly enough, relative to that, parents who lose children to homicide are most likely to suffer from suicidal ideation, and they are the most likely secondary victim to die of suicide. So those secondary vicarious victim costs can be absolutely staggering. Okay. Other things that cause that vicarious victimization are going to be constant and chronic media coverage. The loved ones, the family, the friends of the lost of the loved one, they're going to relive that trauma again and again every time it's on TV. Unfortunately, we see this every time there's a school shooting. It's on the news cycle just 24/7, being played again and again and again for weeks. So all of those family and friends and the people in that community that suffered that victimization have to relive it constantly, and it just causes greater damage and greater trauma. Okay, so that is another example of that vicarious victimization. And finally, the final cost of crime is going to be increased fear of crime. Okay, fear of crime is it's an interesting phenomenon because it's individual to all of us, right? My perception and my fear of crime is going to be different than your perception and your fear of crime. We all perceive things differently. So it's going to vary from person to person. But obviously, those who are victimized are more likely to have an increased rate of fear, as are those secondary and tertiary victims, which may or may not communicate the actual reality of the crime threat in your area, right? So if I'm victimized, my perception of fear of crime is going to increase vastly, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's demonstrative of the actual threat that exists outside of my door, right? But it is going to dictate how I make my decisions, what behaviors I'm going to engage in or not engage in as a result. So that, again, can be a cost of vicarious victimization.